Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Patrick Bowland and the murder of James McKenna, which took place in the Pilgrim Street area of Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1881. In some areas of this story there is less evidence than usual, so this will probably be a little bit shorter than normal. I hope you will still find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Sadly, the backstory of those involved in this week's story is almost non-existent, so the details will be quite basic. Patrick Bowland was said to be around 39 years old at the time of the crime was committed, so would have been born in around 1842. It was believed that he was born in Ireland, and his parents and other family members are unknown, and Patrick was working as a labourer in 1881 and living in a lodging house in Pilgrim Street. It's also unknown if he had ever been married or not. James McKenna, the victim, was said to be around 22 years old at the time of his death, so would have been born in around 1859. He was born in Ireland, but his parents and other family members are unknown. James was working as a labourer and lived in the same lodging house as Patrick Bowland. It is not known when either man first moved to the UK. Due to many of the people involved in this story having the same Christian name, I will refer to them a lot of the time by their surnames to hopefully avoid any confusion. On the night of October the 22nd, 1881, James Routledge and James McKenna went out together for a few drinks in Newcastle. They returned to James McKenna's lodging house, and here they found two other men in the kitchen. Patrick Rogers, who was making himself some tea, and Patrick Bowland, who was sitting close by on a form. Both men were somewhat the worse for drink. When they first entered the room, McKenna spoke to Rogers, but it was not clear what was said. A few moments later, the two men began to fight. Rogers was so drunk he was hardly able to stand, and was quickly knocked to the ground and did not get up. At this point, Bowland decided to join the fight, and McKenna and Bowland fought for several minutes before Bowland, who was also very drunk, said he would give in and went to sit on the bed in the room. McKenna was not happy about this and went over and hit Bowland again. Bowland then struck out at him several times, pushing him away. And it was then that McKenna shouted out that he had been stabbed, clutching at his chest. He then fell onto the ground. Routledge, who had been watching the fights, shouted for a policeman and stood in the doorway waiting for one to arrive. When the police arrived, they found McKenna on the floor bleeding badly, and a doctor was quickly sent for. McKenna was still alive when the doctor arrived, and he attempted to dress the wounds and put him to bed, but the blood did not stop, and he was sent to the Royal Infirmary at Forth Banks. And the police, acting on information from Routledge, arrested both Rogers and Bowland on suspicion of wounding with intent. A police court hearing was held on Monday morning at the Newcastle police station, where both Rogers and Bowland were officially charged with stabbing James McKenna. Neither men were represented at the hearing, and it was said that both men appeared to be ashamed of what they had done, and that Bowland also had his hand wrapped in some blood-stained cloths. Superintendent Tunner said James McKenna was still in the Royal Infirmary and was too ill to attend the hearing, and it was not yet known if he would recover from his injuries. He asked that there should be a remand granted to allow time for a statement to be obtained from McKenna. James Routledge said he was a friend of James McKenna, and although he did not live in the lodging house, he did live in Pilgrim Street. He said he had been out with McKenna on the Saturday night, and they had had 3 glasses of beer each. He said he did not feel that McKenna was drunk. He said they returned to the lodging house and found Rogers making his tea in the kitchen, and Bowland was sitting on the form in the room. Both men appeared to be very much the worse for drink. He said that Roger spoke to McKenna, but he did not hear what was said. McKenna replied, and almost immediately the two men began to fight. He believed that McKenna had struck the first blow. Rogers was too drunk to fight and was soon beaten, but Bowland did not seem to like this, and Routledge said he got up and came over to McKenna, striking him on the nose. McKenna and Bowland then fought for several minutes. Then Bowland said he had had enough and would give in. He went and sat down on the bed. McKenna did not want to give in and went over and struck out at Bowland, but Routledge said he did not see where he hit him. He continued by saying that Bowland then appeared to push McKenna away. He saw him thrust out at him with his hand, but he did not think anything of it. Routledge said McKenna then shouted out that he had been stabbed and he was clutching at his chest, and he noticed blood was spreading on his shirt. Routledge said he went over to McKenna and tried to see where the wounds were. Her poker was lying close by, and he said he picked this up as he was afraid that Bowland would try to attack him, and he said he had been right to do this as Bowland suddenly rushed towards him with a knife in his hand, and he said he hit him on the head with the poker to protect himself, and Bowland fell to the ground and lay there for several minutes. He said a woman by the name of Susanna, who had been present at the time, had gone for a policeman, and he stood in the doorway waiting for him to arrive. During this time, he said, Bowland got up and shouted at him, saying if he came inside the room properly, he would stab him. Routledge said he later found that another man in the room had found the blood-stained knife on the mantelpiece, and it was later given to the police officer. When asked, he said he did not know of any previous ill feeling between the three men and did not know what had caused them to fight. Susanna Robertson said she had been in the Pilgrim Street area on the night the crime took place. She had heard a lot of noise and shouting coming from the lodging house and decided to go inside. And once there, she had seen the men fighting. She did not see who had struck the first blow, but Bowland, she said, claimed he could fight no more and would give in. But McKenna struck him again while he was sitting on the bed. She saw Bowland push McKenna away with his hand, and then heard McKenna cry out that he had been stabbed. She said she had not seen a knife in Bowland's hand. She said she then went to look for a policeman and did not return to the house. Darby Gaffney said he also lodged at the house in Pilgrim Street and had been present for some of the time when the men were fighting. After McKenna said he had been stabbed, he said he saw Bowland place something on the mantel above the fire. He went to look and saw it was a blood-stained knife, and when the policeman arrived, he said the knife was given to him. Dr. Baumgartner said when he arrived at the house he found James McKenna lying on the floor. He was alive but unconscious and had several wounds to his body. All he believed had been caused by a knife. He had attempted to dress the wounds and put McKenna to bed, but it was felt his injuries were too bad, and he was later taken to the Royal Infirmary at Forth Banks. He said he felt the man would not live out the night, but as he was still alive today, it was almost impossible to say if he would recover or not. Dr. Baumgartner said he had also examined Patrick Bowland, and he had found he had wounds to his head consistent with being struck with a poker, and also a cut to his hand that may have been caused by his own knife. None of his injuries were thought to be serious. P.C. MacDonald said when he arrived at the house he found McKenna lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and he immediately sent for the doctor. It was clear to him that there had been a fight, as two of the men in the room appeared to be injured. He stated that James Routledge had told him of the men fighting and of the knife on the mantelpiece, which he collected as evidence. He quickly arrested both Rogers and Bowland for wounding with intent, and both men were taken to the police station. He said neither man had made any statements. After this evidence had been given, the bench discussed the case and decided that there was no evidence against Rogers and he was discharged. Bowland was remanded for 8 days. The following morning, Bowland was again brought before the magistrates at the Newcastle Police Courts. Superintendent Tunner said that Bowland was on remand for stabbing and wounding James McKenna. However, on Monday evening, McKenna had died from his injuries, and he would now like to formally charge Bowland with the willful murder of McKenna. This was granted and Bowland was again remanded. The inquest was held at the Durham Ox Inn at Newcastle before Coroner Hoyle. Bowland was not present at the inquest. John McKenna said he was a lodging housekeeper in Pilgrim Street. He said he had identified the body to be that of James McKenna, who was no relation to him, but had lodged with him for around 4 months. He also identified the knife that had been produced as belonging to Patrick Bowland. Dr. Guider said he was a doctor at the Royal Infirmary and had at first treated James McKenna for his wounds. These, he said, had been very serious wounds, and McKenna had died on the Monday night. He said he had later performed the post-mortem, and it was his professional opinion that McKenna had died due to blood loss and the fact that one of the stab wounds had reached and touched the heart and lungs. He said he would not have survived these injuries. He believed the knife which had been identified as belonging to Bowland was just the kind that could have caused the wounds found in the chest and neck of James McKenna. The rest of the evidence given at the inquest was the same as that given at the police court hearing, and the coroner then addressed the jury, stating that he felt enough evidence had been given, and he was of the opinion that the only verdict could be one of wilful murder. The jury, without retiring and with just a few moments' discussion, returned a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against Patrick Bowland, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for James McKenna. He did not seem to have family in the area, and if his family were poor, then it would have seemed unlikely that they would have been able to have had his body returned to Ireland. It was most likely that he was buried in what would have been known as a pauper's grave. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for James McKenna anywhere in the area. The trial took place in January of 1882 at Newcastle, and as with last week's story, no location was actually given, but it would have most likely taken place at the Moot Hall. Prior to the trial, the magistrates had thrown out the murder charge and reduced it to one of manslaughter. Patrick Bowland pleaded not guilty to this charge of manslaughter. The majority of the evidence given at the trial was the same as at the inquest, so I will only include the new details. Shortly before his death, a statement had been taken from James McKenna regarding the fight in Pilgrim Street, and this was read out to the court and went as follows. On the night of the 22nd, I went out to Newcastle with James Routledge and some other friends. On returning to my lodgings, I got into a fight with Rogers and Bowland. We struck each other several times before we were separated. I was then stabbed in the neck and chest several times, but I did not see Bowland with a knife in his hand. It was stated that McKenna had not been well enough to give a very detailed account of the events of October the 22nd, and that he had died a short time after his statement had been taken. James Routledge gave much the same evidence as at the inquest, only adding that although he did not see Bowland place the knife on the mantel, he was told by a man called Gaffney that it was there. He said he had looked at it and seen that it was covered in blood. He had later told P.C. MacDonald about where it was. Dr. Baumgartner spoke of first examining the wounds to the chest of James McKenna at the house in Pilgrim Street. He said one was very deep, and although he could not be sure at the time, he felt it could have easily touched the heart. He said there were 2 more wounds to the chest, both quite deep, and he was not able to stop the bleeding. There was also a wound to his neck, but this had not been as deep or as bad as the others. He said he had also been present at the post-mortem and noted that McKenna's lungs had been filled with blood. Patrick Bowland did not give evidence on his own behalf. Unfortunately, I was not able to find any details from the trial of anything said by the prosecution or the defence, nor were there any details of the judge's summing up. However, we can assume, as was the usual case, that the judge would have stated that it was for the jury to decide if they believed Patrick Bowland was guilty of manslaughter. And the jury retired for only a few minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against Patrick Bowland, and the judge then sentenced Patrick to 7 years penal servitude. I was unable to find any further details of Patrick Bowland after this date, so I do not know what prison he was sent to or what happened to him after this trial. This was another very tragic case where alcohol played a very big part. It's not clear why the men decided to fight, and there was no evidence to suggest they had had a previous argument. It seems very much to have been a spur-of-the-moment situation brought about by the fact that all of the men had been drinking, and some of them had been drinking very heavily. And I also believe that if James McKenna had left the situation alone after Patrick Bowland said he did not wish to fight anymore, then the outcome may have been very much different. So sometimes it is better to give in and leave well alone. And it is also possible that Bowland, even in his very drunken condition, feared that McKenna would kill him and had struck out with the knife to save himself. However, it seems this was never suggested as a defence. I do agree that this was a case of manslaughter. There was no evidence to suggest it was premeditated, so could not have been willful murder. And I do not think really that the jury could have found Patrick not guilty of the crime. But what do you think? Was this just a fight that went terribly wrong, resulting in one young man losing his life? Or do you think there may have been previous bad feelings between the men to cause such a fight in the first place? Do you think the jury was right to find Patrick guilty of manslaughter, or do you think he was guilty of murder? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.